In our last video for Unit 1, we're going to talk about the first government of the United States. Okay, in our last video, we talked about the Declaration of Independence. We know the Declaration of Independence leads to the war, the American Revolutionary War. And in U.S. history, you'll talk about all the war and the battles and all of that. But we're going to stick with the government aspect, and we're going to jump from we declared independence, we fought a war, and now we've got to create our first government because we are now an independent nation. Our first government is going to be called the Articles of Confederation, and basically what's going to happen is we're going to go from one extreme to the other. We've gone from our complaints against the king. Okay, the king had all this power, he was a tyrant, so we've gone from one extreme and we're going to go to the other extreme, where our government is going to have very little power. Most of the power is going to be the hands of the people in the states. So let's, I would draw this, if I were you, this little pendulum here. A pendulum is like a clock, it swings back and forth. So we're going to go from one extreme to the other. This is an analogy that we're going to use again next unit. So I really want you to draw this. So over here, one extreme is going to be the British monarchy, and the other extreme is going to be the AOC. Okay, from one to the other. All right, so some of the complaints that we had against the king, if you recall from the Declaration of Independence, our breakup letter with the king, is that he is a tyrant, okay? He has too much power, and he is doing things that have abused this power and his authority, okay? Parliament is taxing the colonists without representation in the legislature being Parliament. So there's no taxation without representation. If you remember all the taxes, the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Tea Act, the Townsend Act, there's lots of taxes. The colonists aren't happy with it. The colonists aren't happy that they can't trade with other countries. This is the Navigation Acts. Remember that they're only supposed to trade with their mother country according to the principle of mercantilism, which means under the Navigation Acts they had to stop at British harbors first. Okay, the colonists are complaining that they can't move past the proclamation line. They can't move west because they're supposed to ease the tension with the Native Americans. They don't want to do that. Okay, so they can't move west of the proclamation line. That makes them unhappy. They have all these unfair trials. Think back to the Boston Massacre. Instead of getting the fair trials for the Boston Massacre, they have unfair trials. No jury. They're just put under military rule. Quartering of troops. They're forcing the troops to stay with the colonists, and the colonists don't want them there. Okay, so basically this national government, the national government of Great Britain, has too much power. It is too strong. So I want you to write this. Basically, the national government, underline that, is too strong. There's a national leader who has too much power. The national government is taxing them too much. The national government says they can't trade with other countries. The national government says they can't move west. The national government has unfair trials. In fact, it doesn't even give them a trial in certain cases. And the national government's military is being forced to stay with them in their houses. Okay, so these are the complaints of their old government. Okay, so much like if you have parents that you do not like what they do, when you get out on your own, you're going to do the exact opposite. Okay, think about like a parent who is a drunk, or a parent who has been to prison, or a parent who has abused their children. Lots of times the children grow up and they say, I'm not going to be like my parent, or my mom, or my dad. I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to do something different. Okay, so the colonies are very similar. They do not want to be like their parent, their mother country, or England. So they get out on their own once they declare independence, and they do something different. So in the Articles of Confederation, instead of having a tyrant king or a tyrant leader, there is no executive leader. There's no president under this new government. There's no king. There is no one person in charge of the government. Okay? To fix this issue with the taxation without representation, every state, all the colonies are now states, is represented in Congress. Okay, they're creating a legislature. It's not going to be called Parliament, though. It's going to be called Congress. And this Congress, this national government, cannot tax the people. However, the states can tax the states. So North Carolina can have North Carolina taxes, but the United States cannot have federal taxes. Okay, so each state has taxes, and each state has an executive leader, but there is no U.S. executive leader. There are no U.S. taxes, and each state is going to be represented in Congress, and Congress is going to be able to pass laws, but it's going to be very, very difficult. Okay, in response to not being able to trade with other countries, Congress cannot regulate trade. Okay, you can trade with whoever you want to. The states can trade with each other. They can trade with other countries, with other colonies. In response to not being able to move west of the proclamation line, they repealed the proclamation line and in fact passed what we call the Northwest Ordinance. And this in fact encourages the colonies, or the colonists, former colonists, the Americans, to settle in the Northwest, okay? It gives them incentives to move to the Northwest, to settle it, to expand the United States. In fact, you're going to see that this is really the only success of the AOC. The AOC is going to be a wash. It's going to fail miserably. And this right here, the Northwest Ordinance, is really the only success. So put a star by it and put only real success, because all the other things are going to be kind of failures. In response to unfair trials, there's going to be no national courts. So you see a trend here. There's no national executive leader. There are no national taxes. Each state's going to be represented in the National Congress, but the National Congress cannot regulate trade. There's going to be no national courts. So there's no executive branch. There's no judicial branch at the national level. There's only a legislative branch, which is Congress. And Congress doesn't have a lot of power. In response to quartering troops, there's not going to be a military at all for the United States. Each state's going to have its own militia, but there's not going to be a U.S. military. Okay, you see how we went from the national government in England having way too much power, which colonies complained about, and in response, the national government has no power. Okay, it's way too weak. In fact, the state governments are going to be too strong, because each state has its own executive leader. Each state has its own taxes and its own legislature. Each state can regulate trade. Each state has courts. And each state has a military or militia. So we've gone from one extreme, where the national government is too strong, to the other extreme. This is going to prove to be a problem, because this man named Daniel Shea. Daniel Shea leads a rebellion. He is a farmer. He is a veteran from the war, the Revolutionary War, and if you're a farmer and you've been fighting in a war for several years, then you are not farming while you're at war. So basically, the government promised, the Second Continental Congress promised, if you fought in the war for us, we will compensate you for this. We will pay you. You've got to pay your soldiers. You can't just expect men to fight for free. And so Daniel Shea is waiting for his compensation after the war, and he's not getting it. He's not getting paid. And neither are any other farmers, and so he's very upset about this. And so he leads a rebellion. Well, why isn't he getting paid? Because the national government can't tax. The national government has no money. It has to pay for this war that it just had. It has no money to pay for its troops and its soldiers that fought in the war. And so Daniel Shea and other farmers are not getting paid. This event single-handedly reveals the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and leads to its downfall. Okay? Some of the weaknesses, obviously, are, write down the weaknesses, that the national government is too weak. There's no executive leader. There's no president to put down this rebellion. Okay? There's no king to put down this rebellion. There's no executive branch that can enforce the law. There are no national courts, so that if they ever did put down this rebellion, there's no way to try Daniel Shea unless his state chooses to do so, and his state is completely supportive of their farmers and the veterans. And no state said, the state said, we didn't promise them money. The national government promised them money, and the national government is not living up to this. Because there's no national courts to prosecute him, and there's no national taxes to actually pay him, which is the first problem, and they can't regulate the trade to help raise taxes or money, all of these are indicators that the national government is unfortunately too weak under the AOC. And it's not like they can just get together and fix the AOC and pass any amendments, because to change a law, 13 out of 13 states have to change a law. I don't know about you, but if you put 13 people in a room, it's very hard to get them to agree. And basically, these are a whole bunch of old white dudes, and they are not, if you've ever sat around a bunch of old dudes, like think about your grandparents, in a room, if you put all of them in a room, you could not get 13 of them to agree on a single thing. So it is pretty much impossible to fix the AOC, because it's impossible to get 13 of these people to agree on something. You got to have 9 out of 13 people to add a law. So this is going to prove to be a huge problem. And I know this is such a downer to end on this unit, but this is the end of the unit. Okay, we had the colonies established. They brought over ideas. They borrowed ideas from the philosophers that helped them write the Declaration of Independence after all these conflicts that led to the Revolution. The Declaration of Independence showed all the complaints against the tyrant king and how he is abusing his power and abusing his authority. And those problems with the king led to the establishment of the AOC, but then the AOC is too weak and it fails. And our first government of the United States sucks. And that's the end of this unit. You'll find out what happens next unit.